You are listening to the podcast of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors, external contributors, and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.
So, hello everyone. This is the second episode of MCC Learning Institute's podcast series dedicated to education with Dr. Joanna Williams and Dr. János Setényi. Today we are going to discuss the meaning and background of classical and progressive education. And let me introduce our guest. Dr. Joanna Williams is a former university lecturer, academic, and visiting fellow at MCC. And Dr. János Setényi is a director of MCC Learning Institute. My name is Richárd Fodor, and I'm head of research at this institute. And let's talk about the fundamental issues connected to this. What is progressive education? We usually hear this concept rooted in the Latin word progrero, meaning bringing something forward. And at the end of last month, a Hungarian former education policy leader said at a podium discussion that schools should be progressive and teachers should be following their own ideas like a conservative ideology. So let's start with progressive education and your thoughts about all of this.
Mm-hmm. So to my mind, progressive education, when we talk about that in the West, is most firmly associated with the American philosopher John Dewey, who was writing in really around the beginning of the 20th century. And his ideas, even though he was writing at that time, were very much based upon an older philosophy, which could be traced back essentially to the ancient Greeks, but most notably to the French philosopher Rousseau, who wrote a famous book, Emile, on education, which is a very child-centered philosophy. It has the idea that children are not innately sinful, but are innately good, and the world can be damaging to children. So children need to be kind of saved, if you like, from knowledge, rather than being introduced to knowledge. Need to be saved from knowledge, and teachers need to take as their starting point the needs of the child. And look at child development as being the number one goal of pedagogy. And this was very much the idea that John Dewey took as his starting point to create a very child-centered education. And when you start with the child, what you're thinking about again is not the past and not knowledge, but you are very much thinking about the future, and you're looking at the child's needs in the immediate here and now, but also what you might want society in the future to look like, and how you can create future citizens for this kind of imagined better world, if you like. So it removes knowledge and puts the child at the centre of teaching and the child at the centre of schools.
I would add, it's an admirably precise description, Joanna. Thank you very much. What I would like to add is that it's a revolt of emotions, basically an anti-capitalist thing. Rousseau, of course, and the French. They have the progressive suspicion concerning all institutions and systems, and they think that the child is basically a rosebud, a very clean, beautiful rosebud, and the only thing is to nurture this rosebud, and then the rosebud will flourish. To be honest, in the past, let's say 2 centuries, they produced, the progressive, some very interesting methods or methodologies, and I personally can imagine that normal schools can use some of those methods purposefully, of course. Let's say motivation or self-paced learning can have a place in a normal school. I usually tell my progressive colleagues, of course, the progressives are here in Hungary too, and probably the a soft majority of the education researchers are progressives, especially women, but it's not a very politically correct statement in this radio station. Anyway, that the distinction between us is that as flexible methods purposefully used, I can accept those progressive pieces, but whenever you make ideology or a substitute of a religion of these methodologies, then I quit. It's too much. So that is the line of division between us.
I think it is important to look at the difference between the thinking and the ideas around progressive education, and we can either find things there that we agree with or that we disagree with, but then look at the reality of how this is actually put into practice in the classroom. And really, progressive education gained ground, it seems to me, in the decades immediately after the Second World War. Seemed to be when it spread from America and through certainly into the UK, Australia, and many countries in Western Europe. And if you look at quite concretely about what changed in education at that time, so even just to give perhaps a quite trivial example, schools changed from having children sitting in rows facing the front and looking at the teacher, to having desks that were arranged in small groups with children looking at each other, for example. They changed from the teacher being a figure standing at the front of the class, talking to the children for most of a lesson to impart knowledge, to direct the children's learning, to much more focus upon projects and group work. And I agree with János, you can see that there might be some advantages to some of these approaches as a form of pedagogy and as a form of getting children to engage with learning and engage with ideas. You wouldn't want to just rule these things out as being bad for all time. But I think one thing that strikes me is actually this is quite deceptive and quite dishonest as an ideology, because the idea that children are in charge of their own learning, the idea that learning can be self-directed even from the youngest children, might work if you have a very, very small group of children, if you're just working with 2 or 3 children perhaps. But when you have a class of 30, 5, 6, 7-year-olds, all of them at different stages with different interests, the idea that they are going to collectively dictate the course of their own learning, that just doesn't happen in any practical sense. So you get a pretense of child-centered learning. My other problem with it is that progressives often present this as being a very egalitarian thing, a progressive in a political sense as well, of promoting a form of social equality, that this is better for children from disadvantaged backgrounds or from deprived communities to have this form of progressive education. I actually think it's completely the opposite, because what happens if you've got a child who comes from a very middle-class home where there are lots of books, children go to museums at the weekend, the parents are talking to the children about high-level ideas, and then that child goes to school and the teacher says, "Okay, Johnny, what are you interested in? What would you like to learn about today?" That child will say something from the museum they went to at the weekend. Whereas if you take a child from a more deprived background, perhaps from a home that doesn't have lots of books, a child who's not going out to museums and art galleries at the weekend, that child is unlikely to come up with the same ideas. So essentially what you do by making education child-centered is you reproduce the inequalities that are there in the home environment. So I think for that reason, it's also very problematic.
Not only reproduce, but you prolong a certain idyllic, stress-free environment for a while, but the end of the story, and after graduation, the end will be very bitter, because they were raised in a spirit that they are okay. School is fun. and everything was nice. But then suddenly, one boy goes to the university, and the other is starting kebab or massage or a mailing service and packing boxes and things like that. And they don't find the explanation for that, because they were together and they made projects. So this meritocratic, knowledge-based, and a little bit even competitive thing helps you to benchmark yourself, to measure yourself, and to improve yourself as a consequence.
I think, another way of looking at that as well is that it doesn't give children any insight into there being a distinction between working and playing. So I think even for the very youngest children, I think both, it's important to say that both are very, very important. Play is vital for children. And I think the problem is when we try and say that we should blur the boundaries between playing and learning, playing and formal education, we end up destroying both of them. Children should be left to play on their own. And as soon as we come along as teachers and try and sneak learning opportunities into their play, we actually take all the fun out of it for them, and we prevent them just being able to get on with it and make friends and play themselves. And at the same time, we tell them that learning is not something to be taken terribly seriously, that learning itself is mixed up with play. So you can get children who are quite old, 15, 16, who've never had to actually take anything very seriously. Everything's just been a mixture of work and play blurred together. And, to go into János's example, when young people then do go out into the world of work and discover that actually it's not the same as playing and it's not fun all the time, I think it does, I agree, it can come as a real shock to them.
Connected to this, let's talk about alternative or reform schools. In 1900, there was a Swedish educator lady called Ellen Key, who has published a very famous book titled Das Jahrhundert des Kindes, the century of the child. And this is the beginning of the alternative movements, from which in Hungary, I think Waldorf by Rudolf Steiner is the most famous, and Montessori as well. What do you think about, of course, it's a very hard question, very general, but what do you think about these approaches?
If the school follows some middle of the road approach, so they use the brand and they have some interesting methodologies which they consequently do, but otherwise they're a normal school with normal expectations. That is part of the educational market, and it makes it colorful and it's okay. But there are some schools who follow these as quasi-religions, and the children suffer at the end, because after a while they have to go to the, let's say, especially on the secondary level, if they go to the grammar school by definition, at least in this country, is a challenging task. It's knowledge-based and academic. And these children often fail in this environment. Those are the exceptions where the parents at home provide extra tuition for them, or they buy extra tuition. But what is the meaning to put a child into a so-called alternative school if in the afternoon the child has to go to the extra education to cope with the requirements?
No, I agree. I think the problem is when we do these things en masse, again, you come back to this idea really of what is a school for, and when you take this child-centeredness to the extreme, I think one big problem is that, perhaps to say something obvious, but children don't know what they don't know. Only we as adults and as teachers know what there is in the world that children should know and what it is that they don't know. Left to their own devices, children will never come up with the things that they don't know. So I think that's why as teachers, our responsibility is to introduce children to knowledge, to introduce children to knowledge of the world, and to make them aware of what they don't know, which, like I say, that left to their own devices, they're in their own imaginations, that they can't come up with that themselves. And I think the danger is when we go to these very extreme alternatives, we risk letting children down because we abdicate our responsibility as adults and as educators to actually introduce children to the world.
Let's move towards classical education, because we are living in a several thousand years old culture in Europe, and there is a Western European revival of traditional approaches towards education. MCC Learning Institute and MCC Brussels published a declaration about classical education, and it's not a secret that we are also publishing an edited volume of the topic, and the main question is, how do you define classical education?
Mm-hmm. So I think there are a number of ways that we could define classical education, a number of different attributes to this. I think my starting point would be, again, in relation to knowledge. It's a very knowledge-centred and knowledge-focused. So we've talked about progressive education starting with the child. I think classical education starts with knowledge. We talked about progressive education looking to the future and being oriented towards an imagined better future society. I think classical education is rooted in the past and rooted in knowledge of the past. And the starting point for teachers is, what is it of the knowledge of the world? What is it of past knowledge from past generations that we want children to know in the present, for them to make with themselves, to critique for themselves in the future? So I think for me, that's the crucial difference. One is child-centred, one is knowledge-centred, one is future-oriented, one is past-oriented. But I think when we take that, we can begin to see education as a transaction between the generations, if you like, again, as our responsibility as adults in the world now, to a responsibility towards children, a responsibility that we all collectively as adults share to raise the next generation, to introduce them to the world, to pass on to them the best that has been thought and said, I think would be a very good way of putting it, to quote the English poet Matthew Arnold, and to have some sense of what that best that has been thought and said is, and then work back as to how we can introduce children to this intellectual legacy, their intellectual birthright, if you like.
What is the situation in Central Europe, János?
I think that the main structures, pillars are still standing, but the meaning behind the whole thing is disappearing. So people are operationally, it's a functioning system with subject-based and knowledge-based curriculum, national curriculum, and serious textbooks, homework, certain exams, a kind of family support which is still expected. The teacher is still in the central position. But this postmodern culture is coming from magazines and from the digital space, eroding things. And the first phase of this erosion is not necessarily attacking the structures, but people forget the meaning, the sense of their activities. So the routine is still there, but if you ask a teacher why homework is so central and important, the answer is that this is what we have done, and when I was a child, we had homework as well, But the actual function of the homework has already been more or less forgotten. There are exceptions, of course. So this erosion, the rot, can be stopped still by this wake-up call and strong focus and good communication about the virtues and the functionalities of these classical elements. We will see in the future.
Mm. I think that's a very important point about the form that things take on the outside and the actual content, the meaning that we give to that form. And I think for that reason, we really struggle to have classical education anywhere in the Western world, it seems to me, at the moment, because you can't kind of have half classical education. You can't have that sense of the importance of knowledge, of cultural transmission, of passing on an intellectual birthright, if at the same time you have children sitting in groups and asking them, what are you interested in today? What would you like to do? So to go back to all the things we've been talking about earlier, if you are going to transmit knowledge as this important cultural inheritance, it also suggests that the teacher is an intellectual authority, and it also suggests an approach to discipline, an approach to classroom management, essentially. And the problem is if we try and do one without the other, or try and have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, you just end up with a very confused picture, I think, that doesn't actually succeed in doing anything properly.
Let me have about the state of things, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, a short example. It's a Slovak initiative, but it's not that important. Catholics trained partly in Oxford came home. A former Hungarian castle is a nice place, not far from the capital. You have to pay tuition fees. It's a 1-year program. You read the great books of Western civilization, 12, let's say, in a 1-year program. So 1 book per month. You pray, you eat, and you discuss together. That's it. And this is popular for higher education graduates, which means that this kind of master discipline thing and discussion and absorption of the great books of Western civilization, this never happened before with these university graduates. These are highly educated people who needs more, who have a desire to get some real education, and they come and they pay for this 1-year thing. They live, most of them live in this college inside, and some 60% of these inmates is marry later together. It's a mixed team, which means that they find some companionship there, and they had the primary education in a normal European country. It's an average GDP and nothing special, but it's still very much okay. OECD, EU membership, and so and so. And they have the secondary education plus the higher education, the special, mostly vocational higher education, not bad quality, and they never met before this kind of learning. That tells a lot about the state of classic education on the continent.
It does, but I think what's really heartening in that story is the fact that students are wanting to have this kind of education, and that's something that rings true with me as well. That increasingly I meet young people who are frustrated at the inadequacies of their own education and want to know more. And perhaps I'm being a bit idealistic here, but I think some of the behaviour problems that we have in schools right now are precisely because we're not teaching children, we're not giving them any sense of the importance of why they're in school. And I think if I was to go to school every day and just feel like I was wasting my time, or just feel like people were just trying to entertain me or keep me busy or keep me off the streets, but not actually teaching me anything, I think that would make me very frustrated and want to behave badly. But I think taking children seriously and saying, this is a difficult thing that we want you to engage with. You're going to find this book challenging, but we know you're up to it. You're going to learn something really interesting by putting the effort in to engage with this. I think children rise to the expectations that we have of them. And if we can persuade children, and that's our job as teachers, to persuade children why they should submit. And I choose that word wisely. I think it is submitting, why they should submit to the authority of the teacher, why they should persevere and work hard. Then I think most children I've come across actually appreciate that opportunity and want to do something worthwhile with their time.
Originally, I wanted to ask about whether there has been a golden age of education, but on the basis of the answer of János, can we say that this is the golden age of education?
I'm not sure. The 19th century, Joanna would call it the Victorian age, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and the German Renaissance. Anyway, that was the period where the whole world was imitating European or Western education. Well, let's call it European education. And you can see those Japan, Latin America, those latecomers. They always started with John Dewey. That's interesting. Even imperial Japan with this tradition of half semi-feudal society, but they had good experts and they traveled around the world. China did the same route, and basically everybody. They started with John Dewey, and after 5 years came usually the correction. It was a political decision that the German system should be taken. The Soviet system historically is the prolongation and the sophistication of the German model, simply. So it's a continuation of Herbart and the German pedagogy. And yes, that was a golden age. Now the world is much more balanced, of course. And sometimes we are too critical with ourselves, I think. As one conservative, in one podium discussion here in MCC, a Hungarian professor told us with a mysterious smile that we still have everything on the table for a solution. We have everything. But we just don't want to put together the pieces of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm. I think from a UK perspective, I would really struggle to point to a golden age. I think there have been some very good examples of positive things that have happened in education, but it seems to me that the whole history of education in the UK has been a balance between quality and quantity. So we've had some very good schools and some very good elite education, but the problem has been when we've tried to open that up to the masses, if you like, to expand that to everybody, then it seems as if we struggle to do that whilst maintaining the quality, let's say. But clearly there have been some brilliant examples in the past, and it just depends how far back you want to go. At the moment, unfortunately, I'm embarrassed to admit this, there seems to be a campaign underway in the UK to cancel Shakespeare, to decolonise Shakespeare and show how he was so much a product of empire and how Shakespeare has brought white supremacism to the world and this kind of British exceptionalism to the world through Shakespeare. So I was just thinking about Shakespeare's kind of life. You know, how is it that we could have a genius 400 years ago, almost 500 years ago now, whose works we still read today? And you look at Shakespeare's life, and he was actually a very regular, from a very regular, normal type of family in the Midlands of the UK, went to his local school, but in the context of his local school, seemed to learn the entirety of ancient Greek and Roman literature. And you see that very much reflected in Shakespeare's plays. There's very few of them which are truly original. Most of them are variations of retellings of stories from the classical world. So you think clearly at some point in the late 1500s, it was possible for a child in a rural community in the Midlands of England to go to his local school and learn Greek and Latin and have the world of ancient Greek and Roman literature, civilization made available to him. And I feel really embarrassed to say, well, the golden age of English education was 500 years ago. That's a very pessimistic thing. And I think there've clearly been some good schools and good experiences people have had since then. And it just shows what's possible. But I'd be very reluctant to name a golden age.
Let me speak very shortly about the role of families as well, because sometimes you overemphasize the role of the schools in education. PISA, the international testing, has a side survey of the family background of students. That's a useful thing. And one element is very interesting, that basically every society except of East Asia has the normal distribution of families, that certain families are absolutely pro-education and supporting schools and teachers as well and cooperating with them. But that's I don't know the English word for that, but that's an uneven distribution, let's say that, and the bell curve, yes. And some others obviously are absolutely against school. They despise teachers, and they don't think that education is important. And of course, there is a strong correlation with the employment status of the students. So let's say physical workers tend to appreciate education less than highly educated intellectuals, except of East Asia. And even when the father and the mother is frying noodles on the street 12 hours per day, they think, and they literally think, practically almost everyone, that education is the road to success, and whatever the family has, resources, it should be invested to the future of the child, and that's mainly this channel goes through education. And you cannot restore the golden age of education if you only focus to schools. That's a moral challenge. It's a demoralized society with very, very difficult value problems, and we should make it a bit more clear and future oriented.
I think this is a very important point, and I think I would move beyond even just the family to look at the entire culture in a society, whether you have a culture that values knowledge and art and beauty as well. And I think within living memory, not within my living memory, I hasten to add, but within the living memory of people alive today in the post-Second World War decades, I'm thinking the 1950s, 1960s. In the UK, I think there was really a sense that working class people could appreciate high culture. And you look at the BBC as a broadcasting institution when it was at its best, certainly not today, but there was a sense that you could take high art to the masses and people would understand it and appreciate it and gain some pleasure from that. And you had the most wonderful dramas and art exhibitions and classical music concerts that really gained widespread popularity. But I think since that time, again, in the name of a kind of left-wing anti-elitism, there's been a real rowing back on that sentiment. And now it's seen as if all you can really do is give working class people a kind of cheap form of entertainment, because why would, and not just working class people, I hasten to add, but everybody, these things are seen as snobby and elitist. So you're much better off having a culture that doesn't appreciate these things. And I think that trickles down into family life and into education as well.
Let's hope that we can turn this and we can revive classical education once. Thank you for your participation, Joanna and János. And dear listeners, thank you very much for your attention. We will continue this discussion.
Thank you for listening to this MCC podcast episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en, or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors, external contributors, and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.